the limitations, the restrictions to China trade in the U.S. administration. So it was a very wide subject. Our discussion about that's the discussion. And we had people from so many jurisdictions. We explored the new legislation in Brazil, which is very much inspired in the European model, getting very strict but not enforced yet. So it's still a challenge for those who are investing in Brazilian targets, for instance, and need to assess how data protection policies are in place, and they are just getting there. They're just starting to put policies in place. We discussed other jurisdictions like China and Russia that are still more flexible in terms of data protection, although data has to be maintained in the country, and there are issues with use of LinkedIn and Facebook and other devices of this type. And then we discussed the trend in the U.S. We learned from our American colleagues that there is a trend of states regulating data protection, and particularly in California, very strict laws in terms of data protection that are inspired by the European model. We also learned from our Italian colleagues how data protection is, although it is all uniform in terms of guidelines throughout Europe, different European states apply it in a different way. Italy is very strict, France very strict as well, so you don't have a policy of opting out, actually, particularly for consumers. You have to very much give a specific consent for your data. And we also discussed e-commerce and competition issues, particularly in terms of competition restrictions. I think it was a very interesting topic. We learned a lot, and I thank you all who participated on our table.
Hi, my name is Gil. I'm very happy to moderate for Table 6. Our topic is from Amazon to Taobao, the cross-border e-commerce business. So I'm very grateful for people participating in my table to talk about this. We actually cover quite many bases on e-commerce because that's very much relevant to you if you're buying from Amazon or Taobao. So we cover from conclusions of contracts to disputes. So like how this online electronic contract is concluded and how to avoid those unfair contract terms. And also you do have like a choice of law, choice of, jurisdictions, how this will be, interacted with these consumer protections law in the country because they're selling or they're buying from different countries. So how these different laws will interact with each other. And whether the consumers actually bear the burden of proof to prove that you actually entitled to all these rights under the local laws. So we cover many of that. We also cover like IP infringements, like if you're buying fake products on the e-commerce platform, or you are someone is selling the products and services actually infringing your intellectual property rights, and how would the platform react to this, and what would be liability for the platform to, if they fail to do so. So this is actually something we also cover. We also have like data protection, so I think this is a very interesting topic. We have people from different parts of the world, like, we have EU, we have US, and also some other countries that actually have these evolving data protections law. So data protection is one thing, and we also talk about data localization, because for cross-border e-commerce business, you are getting these data subjects informations in your platform, which is outside of the country. And for some countries like Russia or like India, also looking at the possibility of requiring the localized data center in the country. And then these will be a very costly thing for the business to do. And then data protection, there are other aspects, whether that requires separate consent for data transfer, if your data transfer outside the country, how to achieve that. So it's also something we cover. And also we covered the e-signature, whether that contract is signed by both parties, like, many of you may know they use DocuSign, and then whether that document is admitted, it can be admitted in the court, let's say, for example, in China, and whether that evidence is, can be used without original copy, and how you address those issues. I guess this is really something that's relevant to all of us, that you're buying something on Amazon or Taobao, from the moment you buy, and then to the point that you want to litigate, and this is pretty much we covered in the table. So thank you very much for contributing to that topic. Thank you.
Hi, we have quite a different theme for our table, which is, so this is the product liability table. We have, the topic was how consumer protection measures in one country find their way into other countries. Is it a two-way street? And it's fair to say we probably didn't necessarily answer that question entirely, because there was a lot of exchange of views about different topics that are relevant in different countries in terms of consumer protection. I think probably what we established is that there is consumer protection for products everywhere in all the different countries that we talked about. So one can assume, therefore, if you're advising a manufacturing client, you can essentially assume that there will be forms of protection in place for consumers anywhere that you're advising them that they're selling products. So that was useful to know. Within each country, and this question was posed cross-border, but within each country, we talked about consumer organisations as the driver for change, or alternatively government, so top-up or top-down. And I think consumer organisations in different countries have a varying role. There are consumer organisations in all the countries that were present at the table. Some have a lot of influence in some countries. Others have much less of an influence. So there is a two-way street internally within different countries about where consumer protections are driven from. As between countries, as I said, we didn't necessarily answer the question where everybody's consumer protection measures have started from. I think there was generally a perception that the US is a big driver for consumer protection legislation. And of course, within the EU as a supranational body has a lot of influence, and indeed not necessarily just influence, but there are a lot of mandatory consumer protection measures from the EU that have been driven into legislation in individual member states, even though it wasn't necessarily high up on the political agenda in every single one of the member states in the EU. And then just a few things that we took from the table. Food and drink labelling and restrictions exist everywhere. Class actions don't exist everywhere. We learned a bit about online sales regulation, including the Internet Court, which has started in China. And last but not least, we can't really not mention Brexit, and the question was posed whether or not, even when the UK exits the EU, will we still take our influence from consumer protection measures that are being driven by the EU? And I think probably it's fair to say that we are likely to, despite what may or may not happen with Brexit.
It's table number 8, supported by the International Trade and Customs Committee. The topic was trade wars and important clauses within the agreement. As we know, the trade wars could be the increase of input duties as well as the increase of anti-dumping or trade remedies, which is anti-dumping duties. And first, we analyzed whether an increase of input duties or a trade remedy could be considered as an unforeseen act. We had an important discussion. We didn't came into a conclusion. But the important thing was that we saw that generally the distribution agreements and the commercial agreements, they do not have trade and customs clauses. So I think our first recommendation would be to review those agreements to verify that you have the relevant trade and customs clauses. And on the other hand, we also